everybody, Dan here again, and as you've probably come to expect at this point, joining me is none other than...
Me, Sigi. Yeah, that's
That's
me. Hi.
Sigi. Yeah, he's Sigi. Today, we are bringing you the next in our long-running, well, not that long actually, running series of set reviews. As you may expect, given that Ravnica Allegiance just came out, or the full spoiler came out. I guess it's probably not come out yet. It's probably going to come out a week from now, if all goes well. Yeah, so we're going to be doing our set review of Ravnica Allegiance. Please keep in mind, as with most things on our channel, this is specifically being reviewed through the lens of a competitive EDH player. Now, that is going to be a slightly different metric than someone evaluating the set for standard, or for limited, or for something like a lower power EDH deck, because we're prioritizing things more in line with what a legacy or a vintage player might be prioritizing than someone who is looking to grind out mid-range value through formats like standard, or a much slower and social gameplay like a casual EDH game. So with that in mind, Sigi, do you want to start us off with the cards we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, let's do it. I think we've got a really exciting one here as our first card. It's Smothering Tithe. I did that wrong before. Don't be surprised.
I'm not.
So yeah, Smothering Tithe. It's a 4 mana, 3 and a white, enchantment rare. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 mana. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color.
That's an interesting card. So 4 mana puts it on the upper end of realistic mana costs for the format, but it does put it out of Abrupt Decay range. 4 mana also places it out of Xur range, so it's not going to be something that you can cheat into play pretty easily.
Yep.
It doesn't just trigger on additional cards per turn, which is interesting. That means that the natural draw step of each player, presumably 3, is going to be counted towards Smothering Tithe, because people probably aren't going to be paying 2 during their draw step so that you don't get a single Lotus Petal. Which means that in one turn cycle, you're going to recoup 3 out of the 4 mana that you've spent on this.
Yeah, and even if people were to pay 2 each, that would be a rather big swing in tempo, because you're basically cutting them off, well, 2 of their mana each.
Yeah, which is a good chunk.
Yeah, so, yeah, you just get a guaranteed extra 3 mana each turn, more or less, because, honestly, I don't really expect people to pay for this unless they have way too much mana.
Yeah.
And the kind of deck I'm imagining this in is a slower, mid-rangey, grindy deck, something like E-Man, for instance, or some of the Timler Crom builds. And if you get to the point where people don't have much else to do other than paying for your Smothering Tithe, you're probably in a really good position anyways.
Yeah, that's for sure. People have talked about some combos with this card, well, pseudo combos with this cards. It definitely has some impressive synergy with Stasis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite nice, because you just get the mana to keep the stasis going, and then you get even more mana so you can keep playing while your opponents can't. Another really big synergy with this is Wheel of Fortune and similar cards, because if you cast Wheel while you have this on the battlefield, you just get 21 mana.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, and not just that, as is the case with Wheel of Fortune in many other cases, you are going to be the first one who gets to use those cards. So not only do you gain a ton of mana, you can probably immediately make use of that mana and do something else. Like, worst case, if you run this in a Thrasios deck, you just got 5 free Thrasios activations off your wheel.
That's
That's
not
another
bad.
10 cards that you can see.
Yeah. It's a little sad that your Hot Wheels deck is in Sans White, given
Mm-hmm.
that this was spoiled like days after you posted your first draft, I
Yeah.
think. You're
Yep,
like, look at
not
this
even a
wheel
week.
tribal deck I built. And then this
It would
comes
have
out.
been great.
It would have. So Smothering Tithe. It's a pretty cool card. And I expect to see some testing with it, even if it doesn't necessarily see consistent play right off the bat, because 4 mana is a lot. I'm going to be realistic about that.
Yeah,
But it is a very powerful effect.
I agree. It compares to other 4 mana pieces that we've seen here and there, or possibly even more things. Like, it's probably a bit weaker than like a Seedborn Muse, but it's also mana cheaper. It's kind of comparable, I'd say, to something like Arms Collector, just that you get mana instead of cards.
Yeah. And there's certainly a trade off between the two. But overall, it's a very interesting card.
Yep. All right. The next two cards we have are a bit of a double feature because both of them will go into the same deck
Maybe.
and probably not into a lot of other spots.
Probably.
The first card is Precognitive Perception. It's 5 mana, 3 and 2 blue, instant, draw 3 cards. It also has addendum, which means if you cast this spell during your main phase, instead you scry 3 and draw 3 cards. The normal mode is just drawing 3, so basically if you cast this during your main phase, you get a rather nice upside.
Yeah, and I mean, worst case scenario, it's still a Jace's Ingenuity, which is like, I mean, it's not playable in competitive EDH, but it's fine.
Yeah. And then the second one we've got is Shimmer of Possibility. That one is a 2 mana sorcery, 1 in the blue. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. It's basically an impulse at sorcery speed.
I don't know about basically, it is an impulse at sorcery speed.
I wasn't quite sure if impulse is also random order. That's why.
I believe so. But that's a good point. Either way, they're both.
But yeah, basically, for a 2 mana cantrip, I'd rather it be at instant speed for most decks. In Baral, it's a 1 mana cantrip, and seeing 4 cards for 1 mana is quite good.
I would imagine seeing 6 cards for 4 mana is also pretty good.
That is true.
So yeah, these are potential Baral role players. No other deck is really conceivably going to want them because 5 mana for a draw spell competes with Ad Nauseam, and while this sees a max of 6 cards, Ad Nauseam usually sees like 40, so you're already behind the curve there.
Yeah.
And all of our 2 mana cantrips are instant and look at 4 cards, or instant and look at realistically our whole deck if we want them to. So
Pretty much.
it's not really going to do much in non-Baral decks. But they're interesting pieces for the Baral deck. Precognitive Perception, I also just wanted to have us talk about because I think this card is fantastic. Addendum is one of my favorite mechanics that they've printed at this point because it has a really interesting tension that it adds to normal gameplay. In control decks, there's a lot of pull, not just in deck building, but in gameplay about when you act. Specifically in control mirrors, there's a whole lot of tension on both players about who's going to cast the first spell, who's going to start the counter war, who's going to try and bait cards out, who's going to take actions that your opponent needs to interact with.
Mm-hmm.
And Addendum gives you additional opportunity to act in your main phase, which is usually less common than acting on your opponent's turn or your opponent's end step, which are the most common in general for control decks. So Addendum gives you a lot more in-game decision making. Is Precognitive Perception better on turn 5, or on turn 6, excuse me, if you've made 5 land drops, don't have an additional land in your hand? Do you wait until your opponent's turn and hold up your Sinister Sabotage or your Absorb? Or do you play it on your turn and look at 6 cards and probably guarantee the next land drop, putting you at more mana? Or on turn 8, do you slam this, then get to your 4 mana open or 5 mana open. There's a whole lot of interesting play that addendum adds, specifically with this card, just because of the additional cards you see. But overall, I really like the mechanic, and I'm excited to be able to play with this card in standard, if not competitive EDH.
Yeah. I also like the mechanic quite a lot. It's kind of funny how in Control Mirrors, the speed of the game kind of seems to shift back from instant speed to sorcery speed. And this is a card that plays quite well with that sort of tension.
Yeah, the ebb and flow of the pace of game is something that you often can't super control because it depends on your opponents as much as it does yourself, and this gives you benefits at either part of the game.
Yep.
What do we have next?
Yeah, we've got another enchantment. This one is one I'm personally quite happy about. Verity Circle. 2 and a blue enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, you may draw a card. And then you can pay 4 and a blue to tap target creature without flying.
I think we're playing this entirely for that activated ability, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course.
That's what I thought. This card is pretty interesting. A lot of people started off by comparing it to Rhystic Study, but that's not really the best comparison, I think. This card draws a lot more parallels to the new mainstay in mid-range decks of Runic Armasaur. They're both 3 mana. They both are permanents. One of them has an enormous butt and can kill Tymna. The other one can theoretically tap Tymna at some point. That doesn't seem very good. But they draw cards when your opponents do things like activate mana dorks and stuff like that. So they both fill similar slots. In general, Runic Armasaur is probably the better card, but there are several mid-range decks, specifically Tymna Crown kind of decks, that want a card like it, but can't play it because they don't have access to green. So Verity Circle fills that Runic Armasaur role that the E-Man decks get to play in the He-Man decks, or in the deck names, in the Tymna Crown mid-range decks.
Yeah. In the man decks. Another interesting thing about this is that if people are not willing to tap the mana dogs to give you cards, it kind of acts like a cursed totem. So it's a like soft hate option for mana dogs in decks that want to use mana dogs themselves, like the various Thrasios builds.
Yeah, that is a
That
very
aren't
good
able to run
point.
cursed totem.
That is a very good point. I like it.
One spot where I'm quite happy about this card is Teferi, because I was looking for pretty much precisely another card like this, one that can serve as both hate and a way to get card advantage if people don't play around that hate. So that's quite nice. I can drop careful consideration now.
Yeah, that card is sketch.
It is.
I like Verity Circle a lot better.
Same. Okay. Let's move on to the next color and the next card. We're moving on to black. It's Font of Agonies. It costs a black mana. It's also an enchantment. Whenever you pay life, put that many blood counters on Font of Agonies. And then you can pay 1 in the black and remove 4 blood counters from it to destroy target creature.
It is an interesting new enchantment. When it first got spoiled, presumably everyone would expect that the first place people's minds went was to Necropotence. They're both enchantments, they're both in black. Necropotence directly feeds this. So when you Necro in a deck, you're almost always going to be putting on a murder amount of blood counters to Font of Agonies. And in combo decks, you're probably going to be putting like 12 murders worth of blood counters onto Font of Agonies at once. Which gives you a lot of interesting play. If this is in play before you go off with a Necropotence, and there's something like an Eidolon of Rhetoric on the battlefield that you don't have a kill spell in hand to get around, you can draw your 30 or 35 cards with with Necropotence, activate Font of Agonies, shoot down the Eidolon, and then proceed to combo in like a Shimmerzer deck.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of ways that this is a setup card similar to Grasp of Fate. The downside, of course, is that Grasp of Fate doesn't cost you mana to activate the turn you want to use it. You just put it into play. The upside is that Font of Agonies covers future creatures that can be flashed in or put into play in response. If someone flashes in an Ocean Thief when I am trying to, I don't know, quicken a Windfall, not that anyone's ever done that, Font of Agonies can handle that, whereas Grasp of Fate would not be able to. So in decks that are looking to respond at instant speed with their interaction that they may not have gotten access to yet or something similar, Font of Agonies gives you an opportunity to do that. I don't necessarily know if it's going to make the cut in a deck like Shimmerzer, but it's quite possible that in a Control Zer deck or some kind of toolboxier and slower Zer deck, Font of Agonies is actually pretty good. Decks that are doing the value Necropotence, the pay 4, the pay 6, not the pay 35.
Yeah, I could see this being a thing in a slower Zer build.
It's also just got sweet art.
That's true. There is also some synergy with Tymna, though it's really slow because Tymna is only one instance of life payment, so you'd need like 4 turn cycles of Tymna beats to destroy even one creature. But it is worth noting. I do think the Zer synergy with Necropotence is much, much stronger, and it's also nice that you can just tutor it up with Zer.
Yeah, it definitely plays into what Zer is doing. I'd like it if Tymna gave you multiple triggers on this in a Tymna-based deck, but having to trigger Tymna 4 times just to get the one interaction piece is definitely pretty rough, and to then have to pay mana on top of it after the fact.
Yep. Okay, we do have another black card prepared. This one is mostly interesting because it's worth talking about. We've got Spawn of Mayhem. Yeah, that sentence.
What a sentence. Great transition, Sigi.
Yep.
The consummate professional.
Spawn of Mayhem. It's 2 mana and 2 black, so 4 mana total. Or if you can trigger Spectacle, which happens if an opponent lost life this turn, you can cast it for 1 mana and 2 black, so 3 total. It's a 4/4 with flying and trample. And at the beginning of your upkeep, Spawn of Mayhem deals 1 damage to each player. Then, if you have 10 or less life, put a +1/+1 counter on Spawn of Mayhem. Now, what makes this interesting to you, Dan?
One of the decks that has more recently been seeing a lot of attention is the 4-color Rashmi deck. The Thrasios Vial Smasher, stick a Curiosity on Vial Smasher and start drawing cards out your butt deck that you have been working with and that a lot of people have started picking up. Spawn of Mayhem has a similar damage trigger ability. So if you put a Curiosity or a green Curiosity, because I remember card names. Sure. On Spawn of Mayhem, you'll be drawing 3 cards on your upkeep. And that's not bad for 1 mana.
Mm-hmm.
But it lets you do it without access to red, because Spawn of Mayhem, Curiosity, and Keen Sense are in Sultai colors. So if you're looking at playing a Thrasios Silas, sure.
Or
a
Tassiger.
Or a what? Is that the 2/5?
I think it's a 3/7.
3/7? That's a butt.
Yep.
Isn't that a 5 mana card?
It costs 3 mana, I think. Or
there's no way they'd print a 3/7 for 3.
No, wait,
that's enormous stats.
Black-green one that cost 3.
Yeah, the not actually a food chain outlet card. Anyways, Spawn of Mayhem lets you get that sort of 3-color Rashmi or 4-color Rashmi effect of Curiosity drawing you consistent spells, the whole Niv Mizzet ping thing, in non-red colors, which is interesting if not necessarily acutely relevant.
Yeah, so sorry, my
That was a
take
good mic bump.
on this whole thing, or like the let's say pinger, because this is more or less a pinger. The whole
Yeah.
pinger curiosity synergy is that it's if you can't have one of the pieces in your command zone, like with Vile Smasher, you kind of need to look at it as a like 2-card synergy. You need both of those cards to do anything. What I find good about Curiosity and Vile Smasher decks is that you always have your pinger in the command zone. So if you play that and you just happen to draw Curiosity, then you've got an engine. If you draw one of the pieces and you don't have access to something like a Vile Smasher in the command zone, then you're gonna need to find one of the other pieces before it can do anything worthwhile. And the question then kinda is it worth tutoring for the other piece? And is the synergy strong enough when you have these 2 cards that you'd be willing to tutor for maybe even both halves? Or is it only something you'd use when you naturally draw into one of the halves?
And that is a question, dear viewer, that we will likely leave to you. Would you demonic tutor for a 4/4 flying trample because you drew Curiosity? Because your answer is going to determine whether or not you think they're worth playing together.
Yeah.
I would not be tutoring for a small fatty personally, but that's just me.
Yeah.
It's got a cool mouth though.
We'll leave it up to the viewers to decide. That's a very good idea.
I mean, that's what's going to determine if any of these cards see play, right? We can play them all we want, but that doesn't make them relevant.
You are right about that, indeed. Now, this next card is also quite interesting. We're moving on to red now. We've got Electrodominance. It's an X double red instant that deals X damage to any target, and then you may cast a card with your with converted mana cost X or less from your hand without paying its mana cost.
So you're saying, basically, we turn a bunch of little lightnings into one big lightning?
Yeah, more or less. And sometimes the lightning just becomes like a necropotence or something.
Perfect. I like this card. I don't know if I like it in competitive EDH, but it's definitely got some interesting synergies with the cards people are playing in decks like Yidris. It's also kind of a decent value card that functions like a Yahenni's Expertise or a Rishkar's Expertise.
Yep.
While just being a fireball, which sometimes is good enough, honestly, given that it can target a creature or a player. So it can be an outlet, it can be a removal spell, it can be a 2-mana living death, living end. Yes, either one. Mostly I think it's going to cause a decent splash in Modern.
Yeah.
But it may be relevant in like a Kess deck, being able to kill something, end step, and add Naws for free, and then do it again the next turn.
Yeah, or even just like deploy a cursed totem at instant speed, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, being able to cheat on timing is very interesting with this card. Any card that lets you cheat sorceries or permanents into play at instant speed is absolutely worth thinking about, at the very least.
Yeah. I do think this is a card to be aware of when you're building your decks, especially like slightly slower decks that can afford to just leave up a good chunk of mana every turn cycle. Because as we've seen, for instance, when did we do that? I think it also was in one of our set reviews, where we compared like Stranglehold and Aven Mind Sensor.
Yeah.
And that the big upside of Aven Mind Sensor is this, aside from being cheaper and being a creature, that you can do it in reaction to somebody already having expended the kind of resource you're going to be hating on.
Yeah, you get them with it.
Exactly.
It's the Stone Rain.
Electrodominance can do the exact same thing with literally any other hate piece in your deck. And that might be powerful.
I absolutely think it is powerful. I mean, an instant speed Stranglehold that, if you don't need it, is an ad nauseum or 4 mana drains. Seems pretty good. Do you think this is a kind of card you might run in 4-color Rashmi? Or test in 4-color Rashmi?
I've been thinking about it since last night. I might give it a try if there's something I'm like really unhappy with.
That makes sense. This is a kind of card that I'd love to try out in like a Niv Mizzet deck, but I know it's probably better in a deck like 4-color Rashmi or in maybe a Kess Moons kind of deck. Because instant speed Blood Moon seems kind of cool.
Kess kind of was what I was thinking about first and foremost, because you get the Cursed Totem and similar things.
Yeah. Overall, I think this is a very interesting and I personally think very powerful card. Hopefully it gets to see play in the cEDH meta. If not, it'll certainly see play in multiple other formats, so it's fine.
Yep. It's cool. Okay, the other red card we have is not quite as interesting, but still quite nice. I'm happy that they printed something like this.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Light Up the Stage. It's a sorcery for 2 and a red, and it's got Spectacle for a single red. So if you've dealt damage to, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may cast it for a single red mana. And what it does is it exiles the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn, so for a full turn cycle and your next turn, you may play those cards without any sort of casting restriction other than what's written on the cards themselves. So if you get instants, you can cast them on your opponent's turns. You can even play lands, because it says play and not cast.
Yeah, the difference between how Light Up the Stage is worded relative to a card like Chandra, the...
Torch of Defiance?
No, the one before that. The 4 red that zeroed to do the... Either way. The old version of Impulse Draw gave you until the end of your current turn, and sometimes precluded you from playing lands. Light Up the Stage giving you those cards until the end of your next turn is huge. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely massive. And you can play lands with it. This card is awesome. I think it is going to be a huge role player in Standard, probably in Modern. I don't know about Legacy. And I think it is going to be a very potentially good option in competitive EDH, because it's a 1-mana red draw 2 for all intents and purposes.
I like it quite a bit for the like more glass cannony builds that have red. So even if we haven't seen it in a while, something like a Doomsday Grenzo could probably make good use of this. It might even be nice in a deck like Prosh. Basically anything.
Maybe. Actually, it'd probably be great in Prosh.
Yeah.
I would even maybe play it at Tazri. I don't know. Maybe not Tazri.
Yeah. Mainly the decks that like aren't looking to interact much, but just wanna get there as fast as possible.
Yeah, and I think you can actually even make a case for it in blue-based Doomsday decks, because the ability to exile the cards and then continue the pile is relevant, I think. There's probably some quirky stuff you can do with Thought Scour and this card, because it lets you clear cards off the top and still access them, while giving you farther down in the pile to be able to do things. Like if you exile the top 2 cards and then cantrip, play the land you just drew, and then gush from exile or something. I don't know. I think there's probably some quirky stuff that having access to, but not having in your hand or in the graveyard, the cards that you're accessing lets you do.
Yeah, that could be quite good with Doomsday. I could see that. It's definitely a just powerful card in terms of raw power level.
And it's a 1-mana draw 2.
Getting 2 cards for 1 mana is just so good in various situations. that Light Up the Stage might indeed become a rather big player in various formats.
The only difficulty is just triggering Spectacle.
Okay, we are now moving on to green, and the first card we've got here is Incubation Druid. It's a 0/2 Elf Druid, it costs 1 in the green, and it taps to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. If Incubation Druid has a +1/+1 counter on it, add 3 mana of that type instead. You can also pay 3 and 2 green to adapt 3, which means you put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, but only if it doesn't already have any.
Incubation Druid is pretty cool. It is a 2-mana mana dork, which faces some pretty fierce competition at the slot, because right now we have access to Priest of Titania, which is a 2-mana elf that can tap for usually between 3 and 5 green mana on its own, which is a pretty substantial amount. And Bloom Tender, who can tap typically for 2 to 4 mana on your turn, but in various colors. Incubation Druid is generally going to be weaker than both of those, but what it has going for it is, first off, cost. Monetary cost. This card is significantly cheaper than Bloom Tender, while still allowing you to do Freed from the Real combos, as long as you have a land that can produce blue mana. So it opens up the Freed from the Real Bloom Tender mana combo to budget decks, where Bloom Tender, which is like $30 at this point, maybe more, it's something very substantial for a 2-mana mana dork. May have priced out that combo from budget decks, whereas otherwise it would have been a very useful combo for them to have access to. The second part of Incubation Druid is that I believe there's a Temur Hulk pile that Cameron was talking about, right?
Yeah, if I recall correctly, it's Vigian Graft Mage, Incubation Druid, and Torch Courier.
Yeah, so you use the Torch Courier to give the Druid haste, and then you make Unbounded Mana with the first 2 cards in the pile. So you can draw your deck with Thrasios. It only takes 1 Hulk trigger, so as long as you get that trigger off, you have the mana, and you don't really need to do anything else.
Yeah, it's quite solid all around, and if you compare it to something like the Pilipala Grand Architect pile that came up when Torch Courier was spoiled last set, we can say that Incubation Druid, as just a raw card, is in fact more useful than either Grand Architect or Pilipala.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if it's just a 0/2 that taps for 1 mana, that's okay. And if you then make it a 3/5 that can block and kill Tymna and also makes 3 mana, that's also pretty good.
Yeah.
And you can do it over multiple turns. So, as a card, it's certainly better.
Yeah, I'd say this is an interesting card. People are definitely gonna try it with Hulk, and I could see a deck emerging from this, because if you think about it, the pile is also fairly compact. Like, you've got Flash and Hulk as 2 pieces, and then you're fetching for 3 pieces, so that's 5 Hulk pieces total, which is quite efficient.
Yeah, and one of them doesn't even suck, which is better than almost every Hulk pile that exists.
The one downside this has, however, is that it's not particularly synergistic with other kind of strategies that are usually played with Hulk.
Yeah.
That's the one issue I see with it. It does layer with Bloom Tender Freed from the Real, which could be nice, but that's really about it. It doesn't work with Hermit Druid in any way. It doesn't have any of the Shuffle Hulk synergies, etc.
Yeah, so it represents a potential small Hulk package that you could add to existing Temur Plus decks, where one of the cards isn't abysmal, and the rest are pretty awful.
Pretty much.
So maybe something that is going to see play. And again, that's up to you guys.
Indeed.
Moving on to multicolor, I believe.
Exactly, yeah. This one is Biomancer's Familiar. It costs a green and a blue. It's a 2/2. And it reads as follows. Activated abilities of creatures you control cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana an ability costs to activate to less than 1 mana. You can also tap it to have the next time target creature adapts this turn. It adapts as though it had no +1/+1 counters on it. Probably not going to be too relevant, but the first part.
It's okay. It is a Training Grounds creature. It costs 1 more mana than Training Grounds, but it has 2 power and 2 toughness, more than Training Grounds. But it also dies to Bolt, which Training Grounds does not. It is a Training Grounds that you can find with Worldly Tutor or Green Sun Zenith, which Training Grounds cannot. But it's still just a Training Grounds, and Training Grounds sees nearly no play right now. Yep. Potentially, having it as a creature makes it so that there's less of an opportunity cost, and you're more willing to play it, maybe in some kind of Tymna Thrasios deck, I guess. But in general, the reason we wanted to bring this up is just that it is an additional version of an effect that does see occasional play on a new card type. And that's just worth keeping in mind when you're deck building something like a Tassiger or a Thrasios. You now have a creature that can reduce your commander's activation cost.
Yep. I think that's really all we can say about this one. Now, this next card, however, there might be a bit more to talk about there.
That's for sure.
We've got another 2-mana 2/2. This one costs a white and a blue, however. It's Lavinia, Azorius, Renegade. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands that player controls. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell.
This card hits so many things in the format. For starters, if this is in play, you can't cast Mana Crypt, you can't cast Mox Diamond, Chrome Mox. There's a whole host of spells that are actually just uncastable. You can't alternate cast a Force of Will, you can't cast a Pact of Negation, you can't alternate cast a Mental Misstep, you can't alternate cast a Gataxian Probe. And when I say you, I actually mean everyone but you, because it's just opponents. So you, the owner of Lavinia, or the controller of Lavinia, can still cast your Force of Wills and your Mana Crypts, but your opponents can't. So it is an asymmetrical hate piece, already starting off really good. Also, the lands cap your CMC on non-creature spells is nuts. So many decks in this format rely on mana rocks, dorks, and rituals to get themselves to the mana they need to cast their ad nauseums, or their everything, really, if we're being totally honest. So this shuts off pretty much everything, assuming your opponents are on a low land count, which is kind of awesome.
It's... I think a way to look at this is that it can buy you a few turns. Like, people are probably not going to play a turn 1 wheel with this. I mean, you'd also have to get it on turn 1, but assuming just this is in play, they can't play a wheel before turn 3, they can't play an Ocean Thief before turn 4, they can't add Nors before turn 5.
That's assuming they make their land drops.
Oh, wait.
In a competitive...
They can't cast an Ocean Thief because that's a creature.
Oh, Notion Thief they can, yeah.
Yeah.
But assuming that cEDH players are making their land drops every turn in an Adnos deck is a pretty loose assumption, if we're being totally honest.
I'd say it depends on the Adnos deck. Like, most of them run a full suite of cantrips and other ways to draw cards.
Getting to 5 lands is not trivial, though. Most of the decks run 28 lands. I know from my experience playing Adnos decks, I'm never on 5 lands on turn 5. Like, I can probably count on one hand the number of games that's happened.
Okay. Might be a bit different for me, because I usually tend to play, like, at least 29 lands, even in my fastest decks nowadays.
Yeah, that could be different. it's something to run the Karsten math on. Because
Yeah.
I think it is going to gate spells a good deal more than people expect. Maybe a little less than I'm expecting. But any kind of gating that's also shutting off alternate cast, Force of Wills, and Mana Crypts and stuff is already pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's quite cool. Now, one thing we should talk about, I think, is whether this is going to be more of a standalone commander or an inclusion in like a 98 or a 99.
So if we're looking at Lavinia as a commander, which is the best way to guarantee access or pseudo guarantee access to her as early as possible, probably turn 1, almost 100% turn 2, if you're building your deck with any sort of reasonable land counts. She is Azorius, which means her win cons are bad at best. Azorius decks always struggle to actually close out games. Lavinia does give you access to a couple of single card soft locks with her, like Knowledge Pool and Omen Machine, but they're like 6 mana and 5 mana apiece and awful cards on their own, so it's not like your win cons really dramatically improve.
Yeah. There's also a really awkward part about Knowledge Pool, because if you think about it, after you've set up these soft locks, you still need a way to close out the game. You can't just sit there and hope nothing's gonna happen for, I don't know, 30 turns.
Yeah.
Which means, and the issue is, every like combo piece or win outlet piece you try to find afterwards is gonna go underneath Knowledge Pool while it's out. Now, if you cast that and it goes under the pool, and then you cast another spell to try and get it, as long as one of your opponents has an instant speed spell, they can sort of steal it from underneath you. They're going to cast their spell, it goes into the pool, they take the combo piece you were going to take, and then it's going to get countered because of Lavinia's second condition.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So her bad win cons are even worse.
It's not great, to be honest.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. So if we establish that as a commander, she suffers from the ability to close out a game, but that's the only way to consistently get her in play early enough to shut off a lot of the tempo gated effects that she provides, or to utilize the tempo gated effects she provides, the other option is to have her in the 99 or 98, where you're not going to be able to get consistent access to her almost across the board because there's 97 cards that she's sharing a deck with.
Yeah.
And at that point, is she really going to cut it? Her second ability is going to be strong no matter what. That is just a powerful ability.
Mm-hmm.
But her first ability is going to be much less effective when you cast her on turn 7 or turn 8, when people have 4 or 5 lands in play. So are you running her in a deck that runs Armageddon? Is that actually worth it? What kind of home does she really have without consistent turn 1 to turn 2 access?
Yeah, that I think only time will be able to tell.
I'm excited to try her. I'm not sure where she's going to settle.
Me neither. Another card that's still, in my opinion at least, quite up in the air in terms of where it's gonna land on the spectrum of competitiveness is Prime Speaker Vannifar. She's an elf ooze wizard. She costs
Good
2
type
mana,
line.
a green and a blue, and she's a 2/4. You can tap her and sacrifice another creature to search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature's converted mana cost. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only at any time you could cast a sorcery. So
I feel like we've heard that text before.
yeah. Birthing Pod, for those of you who are unaware.
Birthing Pod is a fairly strong card. It has been banned in Modern after being the backbone for a tier 1 deck for the entirety of its lifespan since New Phyrexia. It was a powerful card in Standard the entire duration of its time there, and it sees fringe play in Competitive EDH. You may recall it being a win out of nowhere card in Blood Pod, because you can cast it, pod both your commanders into Kiki and Felidar Guardian, and combo off, and you can do other things with it, but it is a very, very strong tutor because it can provide iterative tutoring and iterative value.
Yeah.
However, Birthing Pod is an artifact, which means it doesn't need to have haste to activate. So you don't just have to untap it to be able to get iterative value. You can blink it, like with Felidar Guardian. It also means you can use it the turn you cast it. Birthing Pod's mana cost is 3 and a Phyrexian green, which means it really only costs 3 mana to cast. Its activation does cost 1 and a Phyrexian green, though, so there is mana involved in activating it. But one cast and use, the turn you cast it, is still as much mana as casting Prime Speaker Vannifar, and you don't have to wait an additional turn cycle or provide her with the ability to activate on the first turn. So while Thousand Year Elixir and similar cards give her the ability to activate the same turn, that is an additional mana and additional card investment that you're making in her, while also reducing the quality of cards in your pod chains, because it has to be untappers or additional cards and blink effects.
Yeah.
But
we've seen a lot of people. Yeah, we've seen a lot of people experiment with her. There's really a lot work being done, probably more than for any other card in this set.
Yeah.
However, to be completely honest, I'm not quite convinced yet. The thing is, what we've seen so far from Prime Speaker Vannifar is chains of like 10 cards or even more that, and that's the important part, all need to be in your deck as you go for the chain.
And without much doubling up on each slot.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of redundancy.
From playing a lot of Hulk and needing like 3 or 4 cards to be in my deck at one time, it can get really awkward really quickly. If you're doing that with more than double the amount of cards, you're gonna have a bad time.
Yeah, girl, I played Boonweaver Carador for years. It's bad.
Oh, right, you did.
It's bad.
It's yeah.
Like, at least you guys get access to Brainstorm.
Not having synergy with drawing cards is not good.
It's a significant handicap.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if she has the chops and eventually has the ability to substitute these pieces, cut these pieces, trim down her chain to something much more manageable.
I do hope the people who are working on her keep working and keep trying stuff, because the ability is obviously powerful. There's something there, and if decks like Arkham, Sisei, even Yi-san can exist that can win off having a thing in the command zone that gets your stuff, then maybe Prime Speaker Vannifar can as well. One thing I'm personally quite interested in when it comes to this card and the deck around it is the combo of Illusionist's Bracers and Seeker of Skybreak. That gives you infinite untaps for both creatures, which effectively lets you get like infinite chains of creatures. And you can always double up because Illusionist's Bracers is going to copy Vannifar's ability, which means you can get 2 creatures at once instead of 1, which means you don't actually have to like directly go up the chain, but you can set up more or less anything you want.
Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. For the same reasons that Birthing Pod got banned in Modern, I think Vannifar is worth keeping in mind every time we get a new set release. For those of you unaware with their rationale behind banning Birthing Pod, they banned it because it restricted their ability to print creatures. Every creature printed had the possibility of breaking Birthing Pod farther and farther, which is why they banned it in the format. that rationale is why Prime Speaker Vannifar could easily be fantastic one day. Right now, yeah, she may have a 10 card combo where all the cards have to be in her deck and they're all mostly terrible creatures. But in 5 years, it might be down to a 3 card combo where they're all phenomenal. At which point, she's probably tier 1. So, as more sets get printed, she can really only get better.
Yes.
And so for that reason, she is worth keeping in mind and worth this work.
Okay. We've got one more card for the set review, our final card, and that's Teysa Karlov. It's a 4 mana, 2 a white and a black, 2/4 human advisor. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Also, creature tokens you control have vigilance at lifelink.
That last part, though. Teysa is a Death Harmonicon. She doubles up on death triggers. And that's pretty awesome. I don't believe we've ever gotten anything that does that before, right?
Correct.
There's a lot of cool death triggers. There's a lot of cool death triggers.
Yeah. For instance, Skull Clamp might be an interesting one here.
What about Protean Hulk?
Yeah, I guess.
Maybe not. Either way, being able to double up on things like Skull Clamp, drawing 4 cards for 1 mana, that seems pretty above average, if I'm not going to be over-exaggerating. That's a better rate than Ancestral Recall.
Yeah.
Even if you consider the card that you're sacrificing, that's still at rate for Ancestral Recall, and it's only a generic mana.
Yeah.
There's some pretty cool stuff.
Now,
also, this art is gorgeous. This art is so good. Oh my god, I love the Orsov aesthetic that they have going on in this set. Just look at that art.
Yeah.
Oh my god, it's fantastic.
What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so I think the one downside to this card is that she's only in black and white, which kind of restricts what you can do with her. If she also had green, it probably would have been kind of crazy.
Oh my god, that would not be balanced.
As is, now, we've seen a couple of really fringe Orzhov builds, like Bomberman Karlov, that kind of stuff. And I kind of have this faint feeling that there's something there with Teysa and abusing all of these death triggers. For instance, one deck archetype we've seen pop up recently are all the Mad Farm decks. Basically, hardcore Adnors, non-interactive, just try to get there as fast as you can. Something similar to that could work with Teysa, I feel.
Yeah, I guess it's possible. There's certainly some interesting stuff you can do. Skull Clamp gives you extra cards. Maybe something like Athreos gives you the ability to to give you recursion on creatures. Maybe there's a way to... I think there's probably a way you can set up looping Children of Corliss with Teysa. Obviously, the sacrifice doesn't trigger, but the death would trigger something that could get it back. This is a cobble card if I've ever seen one, basically, is what it works out to be. And I'm pretty positive he's brewing with this already, right?
I'm very curious to see what he's going to come up with. Because I know he's doing something with this. There's no way he isn't.
Yeah, this is a very him card. So it'll be cool to see what comes out of his mind with Teysa.
Yep. And I think that's something we can end on quite nicely. What would Cobble do?
Yeah. Do you have any overall thoughts or impressions on the set you want to share, Sigi?
Yeah, I think it looks kind of sweet. It's hard to say whether the set is going to end up being like a huge player overall, because it really depends on how efficient, for instance, the Vannifar lines are going to be and something like that. So if those are not that good, we're probably not going to see any new emerging archetypes or anything. But it does fill some nice slots here and there, like the budget, Bloom Tender, like Verity Circle, like Smothering Tithe. That's some cool stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of novel cards that they've printed. They've given different colors access to cards that we had similar versions of in the past. They've printed some new effects on different card types. There's just a lot of stuff that might be able to make the cut, which for a set is actually pretty solid for competitive EDH. The fact that we talked about more than 5 cards without reaching super far is great.
Yeah.
It just means that overall the power level of Magic is starting to go back to a place where cards have relevance outside of standard and limited.
Yep.
Looking at... go on.
I do think one thing we can say is that it kind of feels like they've gotten more comfortable designing interesting cards again.
Yeah, exactly. Play design, I think, has had a huge role in that. Because we've seen a lot of cards that are balanced for more niches. Look at a Planeswalker from a year and a half ago. We had Ob Nixilis Reignited printed a set before or a set before Jace, the really bad detective. And they're like the exact same card. They suck. They're both 5 mana, +1 draw card, -3, kind of destroy a creature, -8, slant win the game, but not really. You've seen the Planeswalkers this set, right? We have Kaya, who is phenomenal, but very focused on a specific interaction. Dovin is an incredible engine, but you cannot jam him in everything. It's great. Yep. They're building powerful Planeswalkers for specific concepts, as opposed to these general garbage fire value mid-range bullshit machines.
Yeah.
So even just the Planeswalker design direction is incredible compared to where we used to be. But so many cards are doing that. Terramander, that might be my favorite card in the set. It's a better Delver of Secrets in a lot of ways. It's a 1 mana 1/1 that turns into a 1 mana 5/5 like 2 turns later. It's... oh my god, there's so much about the new direction that they're taking with Magic that is what I want to be seeing. The power level of sets is going up, but not in a power crept kind of way. We're re-equalizing back to where we used to be in the Scars, Innistrad, Return to Ravnica era, without necessarily breaking a lot of formats doing it.
Yeah, it's the kind of power I really like, where it's not just, okay, this is obviously busted, stuff like Siege Rhino in Standard.
Hey, we've got a Siege Rhino in this set, sort of.
Yeah, but it's not like a flat kind of design where everyone can see, okay, those stats are above curve, and then it's got a Lightning Helix on ETB. Obviously, this is going to be good. It's
maybe when Polychronos rotates.
It's design that fits into and interlocks with other pieces to become something really cool and interesting. And that also makes it less like insular in a way, or less parasitic.
Yeah.
If you want to put it that way.
Magic's finally moving more towards the multiplicative gameplay they used to have, as opposed to the linear, if we're being generous, gameplay that we've had for a few years.
Yeah, and it's nice. I'm really liking this direction, and I hope they keep going.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Wizards. Thank you, Play Design. Thank you, Sigi. And thank you all of you for watching. I've been Dan. He's been Sigi. And this has been the Laboratory Maniacs Competitive EDH set review for Ravnica Allegiance. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.